I just wanted to start recording, but my girlfriend made me a very delicious pancake, so see you in a second. I'd like to welcome everybody that joined me today because we will talk about why I left Yu-Gi-Oh! For Flesh and Blood. In the Flesh and Blood community, it's actually not that new to talk about a transition from a past TCG to Flesh and Blood. But what I've heard mostly is people transitioning from Magic the Gathering over to Flesh and Blood. And I'm pretty sure under some of the watchers that see this video are also some players that in the past or maybe even now played a Yu-Gi-Oh! Like myself. And that is like the main topic of today's video. But I want to quickly also tell you that this video will not be about bashing Yu-Gi-Oh! Or making fun of Yu-Gi-Oh! So we will not rant about how shitty Yu-Gi-Oh! Is today, but rather see from a casual perspective why, in my opinion, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not that great anymore like it was, and why I think Flesh and Blood is much more fun to enjoy today. And for whom this video is, I think if you are one of my Twitter subscribers, you may have seen that I made a poll about which topic I should talk about this week, and why I left Yu-Gi-Oh! For Feb was clearly the winner out of the 3 topics that I suggested. So if you are under one of those people that voted for it, this video is definitely for you. But this video is also for all the people that I have met throughout the last year, because I am not that long into the Flesh and Blood community. I entered Flesh and Blood in the end of 2021, and before that I was into Yu-Gi-Oh! Collecting and also a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! Playing the card game itself. And I hope also that some of you that watch this video, maybe you are a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player that doesn't know Flesh and Blood yet, and you can relate to some of the things I talk about, or maybe you have a vastly different opinion on this. Either way, please let me know in the comments. Let's talk about this topic and see what you think about it too. Before I jump into the topic, just wanted to quickly let you know that this video will be separated in 2 sections. And that's because at the beginning of this video now, I will talk about the main points of why I left Yu-Gi-Oh! And transitioned over to Flesh and Blood. And then the second part of the video, which I think will be much longer than the first part, I will touch on the background of the experiences I've made in Yu-Gi-Oh! A little bit further, and also why I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is amazing still till this day. And why I think though that in the future Flesh and Blood will be much more enjoyable for me than Yu-Gi-Oh! So what am I talking about? Like maybe not all of you know what I have been up to into the Flesh and Blood community. That's why I want to quickly introduce some of the things I have enjoyed and experienced throughout the last year, because I did quite a few things in Flesh and Blood that I didn't do in Yu-Gi-Oh! Before. And that was, for example, meeting so many of the pro players, but also of the content creators in this space throughout the year and on the biggest events that are happening to take place in the Flesh and Blood. And for example, in the beginning of the year, I had the pleasure to meet Pedro from France. We were meeting up in Paris, also my first time traveling to Paris, and he is a really advocate of the French Flesh and Blood community, but was also a Magic player in the past. And then at the first Pro Tour in New Jersey, I had the pleasure to travel with my girlfriend and meet Pablo Pintor from Spain, who happened to win the first Pro Tour. But I also enjoyed so much time with the staff of LSS and also with all the other content creators that were at the event. And I even got to shoot an interview with James White, the creator of the game Flesh and Blood, who also was a Magic player and also a Yu-Gi-Oh player. And yeah, that was just amazing in itself. Like we were really putting so much effort into the videos last year, and if you want to check them out, we actually made a documentary about the whole thing. So maybe if you don't know about Flesh and Blood and the Proto, that might be interesting for you. But then also in the ongoing year, I experienced something that I didn't knew from Yu-Gi-Oh, and that was a spoiler season, at least like we have it in Flesh and Blood. There are spoiler seasons in Yu-Gi-Oh, but the Flesh and Blood spoiler seasons are vastly different. And I got the pleasure and the honor to have one of the spoiler cards for Uprising, Ghostly Touch, and yeah, that was just super amazing. And then even more events happened, and I got to meet even more amazing people and players. For example, Sander Neft, aka Berg, from the first calling in Europe, the first winner of the calling in Utrecht. And at the World Championship, I met Michael Hamilton again, which, yeah, he won the World Championship. So Michael Hamilton is at the moment our Flesh and Blood World Champion. And I also, coming back to Yu-Gi-Oh, met Newson Zhang and Chris Gearing at the World Championship and talked to them in detail about Yu-Gi-Oh and their past with Yu-Gi-Oh. So, as you can imagine now, touched on a few points in Magic. So we have seen a lot of Magic players, but we also have seen quite some players that are involved in the game Flesh and Blood, like Newson Zhang, Chris Gearing, and James White, who also played Yu-Gi-Oh! And in my opinion, that's a topic that should be talked about more. Like, what influence did have Yu-Gi-Oh! On Flesh and Blood? But that's not the topic of today. Today we are talking about why I decided to leave Yu-Gi-Oh! At least in the efforts that I've put into Yu-Gi-Oh! In the past, and transition to Flesh and Blood. And I have here some categories that are more or less important to me to mention. And I know some people I talk to in the Flesh and Blood community share some of my feelings here. So I want to start with one of the reasons I left Yu-Gi-Oh! For Flesh and Blood is the actual game style. Even though I wouldn't consider myself a competitive player or a player that is playing like every day or every couple of days, I enjoy games of Flesh and Blood and Yu-Gi-Oh! But I'm not playing like 4 times a week. I mostly play like once or twice a week. And the game style of Yu-Gi-Oh! Did change over time. Like in the beginning, the old school formats, like I really dig those. But now when I played Yu-Gi-Oh! The last times with the newer cards and the new mechanics, I really felt like playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Was more like playing solitaire than what it was in the past. And I also think like the power creep, which a lot of people talk about, that I don't like it in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a thing, yes, but I don't think that is the main problem why I left Yu-Gi-Oh! Though I at least wanted to mention it because I know that when I compare the game that I played in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the beginning and from what they are now, they are vastly different, of course. But the main part of the game style is that it is, for me, a little bit one-sided in playing the game. And it is not that exciting anymore. And I want to touch a little bit more into detail about this in the second part of the video. And something that is even more important to me in the game is the story and the art of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's what really touched me in the beginning with all the Pharaoh themes and with all the story evolving around the series that you can watch on TV, which is really different from what I see now in Yu-Gi-Oh! because it has really gone in a direction that I don't enjoy as much anymore. And that is like, yeah, this picture speaks for itself, I think. Some people like it, some people don't. For me, it's not that appealing anymore. And that was for sure one of the main reasons why I looked for another TCG, another game that I wanted to spend time in. Because also what I really love in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the collecting side. So if you would have asked me a couple of years ago, I would definitely consider myself more of a collector than a player myself. And that is also one of the main reasons why I decided to leave Yu-Gi-Oh! And transition over to Flesh and Blood. And I will talk about why I think Flesh and Blood is amazing for collecting when you come from Yu-Gi-Oh! Old school collecting. But yeah, modern collecting really changed Yu-Gi-Oh! As you maybe know yourself. Like the old school collecting was for me really enjoyable and really fun because I grew up on the cards and the rarities. They were just amazing when you had like a holo back then, and now it is like with the Starlight rares, a really different look, something that I don't enjoy myself that much. For me, it's just too much. It's too shiny. It's too much of different variations of the colors in itself. Like the whole picture is just bleeding, and that's just not my style. And also like the newest collector sets, the Ghost from the Past sets, they really set a tone for me that I don't want to follow. And that is like having a chase ghost rare in a set where you don't find that many other cards that you enjoy, but you have to open a massive amount of garbage actually to pull an amazing card. And that's like not the way that I want to collect. Like I don't want to open a massive pile of boxes with garbage inside, like 3 booster packs inside of a small box, and there is so much plastic inside, and then it's not that kind of a chase that was in the beginning of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that this direction I don't enjoy. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's fun. And that was for sure like one of the more pressured reasons why I was looking also for another TCG. But also, I have to mention this, is the community and also the events in Yu-Gi-Oh! That happen. I think that is something that really changed over time drastically. For me in the beginning, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was all about friendship, coming together, meeting new people, having fun. I was going to YCSs, and that was so amazing. And I think going to YCS is still amazing today. I wasn't at a YCS after COVID, and I think there are so many positive things about the events itself. But for me, in COVID, where you couldn't go to events, most of my time spending collecting and having to interact with people in the collecting sphere of Yu-Gi-Oh! I felt the community was really toxic, and it was all about gains. It was not as much anymore about the cards and the interaction with the collectors, especially not as it is in person. And I also included here the photos of the Pot of Greed and the Upstart Goblin, because I really think these 2 cards, of course, they are amazing game pieces. They are fun to play. But when you look at the community and when you look at collecting, I think you find many people that are like this. They are more on how can I make profit off of cards. Not everybody, like don't get me wrong, I met amazing people in the past in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I still am in connection with them today. And I'm still meeting new people in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I think are amazing. But at the time, as I was looking and exploring Flesh and Blood, it was for sure a very toxic environment that I was finding myself in Yu-Gi-Oh! And like I said, it's not a look on, oh, everybody in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like this, but this was for sure something, or one of the top 3 reasons for me that I was wanting to have something else, and I was finding it in Flesh and Blood. But I was really happy actually, as I found out about Time Wizard. So the Time Wizard format that you can play now in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because that is something I think when you are someone like me and you enjoy the older formats more, you enjoy the old cards, you can go to bigger events or to smaller events now and play those decks legally by organized play in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's amazing, I think. I didn't do it myself yet, but I will definitely do it in the future. And coming to events, I want to show you one of the reasons, like, I think it's not my first reason because I'm not that of a competitive player, like I told you. But I think that is very interesting to see and to compare in the games, because now that I am into Flesh and Blood, I actually play the game more and I really enjoy it. Not as in Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh!, even back then when I was collecting actively, I was having so many friends that was also in the hobby. In Yu-Gi-Oh! I wasn't that into playing the game, and now I really love playing Flesh and Blood. And from a meta perspective, I want to show you the comparison, at least from what it is looking at the moment. The 250th YCS just happened to take place in London, and we have here the meta breakdown from the top 64 and the top 8. And we have also a meta tier list graphic that I grabbed from a YouTube video that I will link in the description if you want to check that out. And for example, when you take a look at the meta tier list, here's the tier list for Flesh and Blood, and here's the tier list for Yu-Gi-Oh! And we see we have an S and an A tier here. We have the tier 0, tier 1 here for Yu-Gi-Oh! And you have one deck here in the top corner for Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Flesh and Blood you actually have 4 decks that are at the top of the game that you can choose to play and really have a good chance of being in the tops when you play these decks. But also you have the A class heroes in Flesh and Blood that you can also play and make maybe a good rank with them when you play them good. But I feel we have not that many variants in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta, and that is something that I also hear a lot from the players, that they enjoy this in Flesh and Blood. And I know a lot of my friends that are not playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Anymore. They hated this about Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think that this is also a reason why I enjoy Flesh and Blood that much, because I see a lot of different heroes. It is really challenging to step up against different decks, and you can see this here from the World's Championship in Flesh and Blood from last year. Even in the top 20 here you see a variety of different decks represented. You also see this in the top 64 here in the Yu-Gi-Oh! YCS. But when you actually compare it then to the top 8, I think that is where you can clearly see it. We have here the top 8 breakdown from Yu-Gi-Oh! With Kashtira happening to being represented 75%. And in the Flesh and Blood you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different heroes in the top 8. So 5 out of 8 players are playing a different hero. It's just amazing, in my opinion. You don't see this in Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is for sure a reason why I enjoy Flesh and Blood at the moment. And I also want to talk about a little bit more about the cards themselves, because I know a lot of people are talking about this too. And I want to hear your opinion on this, because here I'm actually not sure which side I feel is a little bit more better, because the staples, the meta staples, for example, Ash Blossom in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it is often that cards that are really needed in the meta are getting a high print, and then later on they are getting a lower print, so people are having more access to it and it's much cheaper. But it also sometimes breaks the value of the higher tier printing of the card that came in before. And I think this is one of the good reasons also to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, because you can get meta staples for a cheap price. But of course, it's really bad if you're a meta player and you bought an expensive meta staple and then Konami prints it in a low rarity and the value breaks. But now let's compare it to Flesh and Blood. And here we have a meta staple from Flesh and Blood, Art of War. And this card also sees reprints, but the reprints are not in a lower rarity. You see here, for example, a reprint of Art of War in the white border version. Of course, this version is cheaper, yes, but it's not that significantly cheaper. Not like this example with Ash Blossom, where the starter deck reprint is like a couple of bucks. And here, and from the Art of War reprint, it is still a high valued card. It doesn't break the bank for the print that came before, but it is a little bit cheaper, but not that significantly. And I hear very different mixed opinions about that. I have to say myself, I would really enjoy if we see like kind of reprints like this in the Flesh and Blood. But I know for sure that some people really disagree with me about that. But that's fine. Just let me know in the comments what do you think about this topic, because that was not a reason for me to transition from Yu-Gi-Oh! To Flesh and Blood. But the next thing is for sure, and that is the actual staples that you have in the game, and in comparison how it was back then and how it is now, and also the rarities that are involved with this. Because here on the left side we have a staple from today's meta in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the Kashtira Fenrir, which its original printing is the ultra rare, and you don't have a other printing of it out of the box. Back then in Yu-Gi-Oh! It was really different, and that was what was exciting to me. For example, with the Stardust Dragon. The Stardust Dragon came in 3 rarities back then, in Ultra Rare, in Ultimate Rare, and in Ghost Rare. And you didn't need the Ghost Rare or the Ultimate Rare to play with the card. You could actually just take the Ultra Rare or wait for a reprint on the Ultra Rare to play it. But you had the option. You had the option of opening up a box or a pack and actually pull this super awesome Ultimate Rare Stardust Dragon. Or even when you are really lucky, get a Ghost Rare. And you don't have this anymore in Yu-Gi-Oh! At least not in the main sets. You have, like I showed you, the Ghost from the Past sets, which you need to buy a really big pile of boxes of, but not like it was back then. And that is what I'm missing in Yu-Gi-Oh! That is what I was finding really enjoyable back then. And actually in Flesh and Blood, when you look at the meta staples and the printings that you find, you also have lower prints of the more valuable meta staples. Like for example the Carrion Husk. You can find it in a German version, you can find it in a rainbow foil version, and then you can have the high-end version, the cold foil, like it is called in Flesh and Blood, which is kind of a collector's piece. And let's just come back to the reprint topic that we were just talking about here on top with the Ash Blossom, because when this card gets reprinted, the Carrion Husk, or this card comes out of the meta, Yes, it drops in price. We have seen this in the past when Chain got Living Legend and Carrion Husk was not that valuable anymore in the meta. The price tanked. And that for sure will happen with Kashtira Fenrir or other meta staples in Yu-Gi-Oh! When they are not that played anymore. But you don't have a collector's version of the Fenrir, right? So you have the Carrion Husk, the Cold Fur version, the collector's piece that you can have, and of course the price will drop, but it will remain a certain value because it is a collector's piece. And that's what I think is really amazing, that they bring this over like they did it back then with Stardust Dragon and other meta cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And you even have these collector's cards that you can play in the meta. So you could kind of say they are needed in the meta, but you don't need to play them because they are not that game decisioning like you need, for example, a Stardust. When you play a Heart of Yendal, that is the card I'm talking about. It's a Fable, it's a really rare card in Flesh and Blood. That is something you could compare to a Ghost Rare. Those cards both were in the meta, and Heart of Yendal is still in the meta, relevant, but it's just amazing, like to see this in Flesh and Blood. And that was for sure, as I have come to find out about this, one of the reasons why I wanted to join Flesh and Blood and was not that interested anymore in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it is not like this anymore. We are actually like the example with Kashtira Fenrir today in Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's not what I like about the game, to be honest. Let's come over and quickly resume here for Flesh and Blood. So what were the main reasons why I thought Flesh and Blood is so amazing? I want to transition over from Yu-Gi-Oh! And that was at first the community and the events, like for example the Pro Tour New Jersey, which I experienced in the last year. It is also the story and the art. So in Flesh and Blood, you can read stories over pages about the backgrounds, about the heroes, about the lands that actually these heroes play in and come from. And the art is just super amazing. I even got to know some of the artists that are working for the game. And that is something that I could never enjoy in Yu-Gi-Oh! But in Flesh and Blood that is actually possible. And it looks super dope. Like, it's just amazing. Like, when you go on Google and go on the fabtcg.com site, like, it's just amazing. And then also something that I think is one of the top reasons for me why I transitioned from Yu-Gi-Oh! Over to Flesh and Blood is we are still in the early days in Flesh and Blood. I think for sure Flesh and Blood will change in the next 10 years. Like, I think it will be not like today. But now in the first years of Flesh and Blood, it's just amazing. And I think it will continue to stay amazing. But like, for example, the Welcome to Wraith set, the first set that was printed in Flesh and Blood, it's just amazing that you can enjoy this today. Like, you can actually be there and enjoy the first set of Flesh and Blood when it came out. You can't do that in a couple of years, for sure. But then also the game style, like I told you, it's really fun for me to play the game. It's really challenging, and it's not like in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you are building up your board and then you pass the turn. And yeah, that's why I included this chess graphic here. I feel like it's much more like chess. But then also from a collector's standpoint, the reprints that we see in Flesh and Blood, we have an actual collector's market. We have really also a commitment from the company that produces Flesh and Blood, a reprint policy like you had it with Magic the Gathering with the reserved list, that the cold foil reprint policy is there to protect cards that you have in your collection. I think that is amazing. Like, I didn't know about this in Yu-Gi-Oh! I heard of the reserved list, but I never could imagine that I was really into collecting Magic, but in Flesh and Blood I think it's just amazing to have this. And also the rarities. So the cold foiling, here is just an example of it, but I can also show you a card in a couple of seconds that you have this amazing rarities. You have the cold foiling, you have the rainbow foil, but you also have now with the newer Fab 2.0 sets, the marvels. And the marvels are really just an eye appeal. They are so amazing. And I think at this point I might even show you one of them. So like for all of you that never have seen a cold foil, this is what it looks like. Whoops, the camera switched. Okay. It's a little bit tricky to show, but yeah, there it is. It's kind of like Ultimate Rare, but in a different way. Yeah, it looks dope. It looks really dope. And also the marvels. The marvels are cards in Flesh and Blood that have two sides. So you have a normal side and then you have a full art side with also the cold foiling on it, which these cards are so beautiful. And it makes me so happy to finally be back again and collecting like this. And it's just not possible anymore in Yu-Gi-Oh! That was really a point that I was missing in Yu-Gi-Oh! And so it was, yeah, it was so many years collecting Yu-Gi-Oh! And pulling cards or trading at the events was a part of my life, but then suddenly like these changes were coming to Yu-Gi-Oh! And it was not that enjoyable, it was not that fun anymore, and that was a reason why I for sure transitioned from Yu-Gi-Oh! Over to Flesh and Blood. Though I wanted to touch on all the positive things I just told you about in the Flesh and Blood, and even that Yu-Gi-Oh! Influenced the creation of Flesh and Blood and how the game is built. But I really wanted to emphasize here that, yeah, the collecting and the game and the amazing events in Flesh and Blood are something that touched on me and that brought me over to Flesh and Blood. But in the core, it is really like the community that makes it for me, the amazing people that I happen to meet in the hobby and that I even can sometimes work with. This is really a healthy environment in the Flesh and Blood. And that is something I was totally missing in the last years in Yu-Gi-Oh! It feels so much different to interact with people in the Flesh and Blood community than it was for me in the last years in Yu-Gi-Oh! It is so amazing. People are so nice. They are so welcoming. It's so easy to go to the store and learn the game or to trade with someone or to build a deck together. And that is like just one of the most amazing things about Flesh and Blood, to be honest. And that said, I have 3 gray cards here that I hear people talk about often. And I want to make this clear from my side is like Flesh and Blood does have power creep. In my opinion, it's definitely there. And we will see this more and more in the future. Like I can't imagine Flesh and Blood without power creep in the future. And I think that is okay. Like for me, it was not a reason why I left Yu-Gi-Oh! That I thought, oh, damn, the power creep is just too ridiculous. I don't think like cards are not enjoyable anymore because the effects are too strong and I can't play with my old stuck deck from 2008 or something in 2020. That's not the point. And you will have this in Flesh and Blood too. And you also have very expensive cards in Flesh and Blood, also cards that you need to play. And I think that is also totally okay because there are ways that you can play the game without breaking the bank. And it is also in the nature of TCGs, I think, that there are cards that are expensive and that are needed. for the game. And I think that is actually a good sign to see this, that we have expensive cards in Flesh and Blood. Yeah, it's just a little bit different, like we talked a few minutes earlier, like in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think that is what I like about Flesh and Blood too. Then the last thing is Flesh and Blood's first 2-year sets are ridiculously expensive. This is something I hear sometimes from people, that they are like, oh yeah, but the first sets, they are so expensive. And I think that's just like about normal. Like you can't expect the first sets of a really successful game, when they have collector pieces in it, to stay for 15 years at a low value anymore. It's not like that. We are not in the early 2000s anymore. That's just the way it is. I think that's, of course, it sucks that you can't buy any card that you like from the first sets, but just the way it is, and there are options for that. But that is just like, that's pretty much how it feels like to me, to be in the Flesh and Blood, and why I love that I transitioned over from Yu-Gi-Oh to it, because for me it's like going back to early 2000, but being an adult with all your experience and all the digital benefits that we have today. And that it also not means that I transitioned over from Yu-Gi-Oh that I will change my opinion about what I experienced in Yu-Gi-Oh. No, totally not. Nobody can change what Yu-Gi-Oh was for me, and it still is amazing. So I'd like to round this up. Transitioning over from Yu-Gi-Oh to Flesh and Blood with, I still enjoy and love Yu-Gi-Oh for what it was, so no need to bash on it. The memories will stay with me forever. I think that is also a really important point, that all the things that was really amazing back then in Yu-Gi-Oh, they are still with me, and they can also still be with you. And I still go back to playing and collecting old school in Yu-Gi-Oh! That is something that I still will do today and tomorrow. And I will also tell you here that a lot of people that I meet in Flesh and Blood are telling me, okay, I sold all my Magic cards, and then I could enjoy Flesh and Blood as I wanted it. I could buy my deck, I could buy some collectibles, and that is like, I did kind of the same thing, only that I didn't collect Magic, but I did it with Yu-Gi-Oh! I sold nearly all my Yu-Gi-Oh! Stuff that I had, and that paid for my Flesh and Blood hobby. And I would do it totally again. And also, for me, with Flesh and Blood, I really have gone hard on this YouTube channel, and that is something that I really regret, that I didn't start this YouTube channel earlier, even though I wanted to do it, or imagined to do it back then in Yu-Gi-Oh! I didn't do it in Yu-Gi-Oh! And now I'm doing it in the Flesh and Blood, and it's just so enjoyable, it's so amazing, and I'm so happy that I did it, to be honest. And that is also a positive thing, I think, for my Yu-Gi-Oh! Past, and for maybe things that I will experience in the future in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I totally want to do videos with Yu-Gi-Oh! Players too, at the events, at YCSs, and tell the stories of those players like I do it in the Flesh and Blood, for sure. And yeah, that's about it for the reasons why I left Yu-Gi-Oh! For Flesh and Blood. Okay, so now for everybody that is still on, I want to touch on this last point, because maybe you are new to the channel, or you are coming from Yu-Gi-Oh! And you are not familiar with what I do on the channel, and that is like something that I want to touch on, because that is something that I brought over from Yu-Gi-Oh! And now I want to do it in Flesh and Blood, and I already did it in the last year, because I really want to let the stories of the gaming heroes live on and be experienced as if you were there. And that is a reason for me why I wanted to transition over from Yu-Gi-Oh! To Flesh and Blood, because the game and the events are ridiculously amazing. And that is what I want to cover on the channel. The people that are actually playing there and the people that are really good at the game, I actually want to tell their stories. But I also want to show with that for me, it's in the hobby not all about finance. That's not the main part of the hobby. I really want to show a spotlight on a different part of the hobby. And I also want to not only tell these stories in the Flesh and Blood, but also in other regions of the game world. Yeah. Of course, I want to inspire the community with these videos to maybe trying out Flesh and Blood or another game yourself, or going to an event. And I also want to have a positive influence with that, for sure. Like I want you to feel good after watching these videos. Yeah, that is maybe not on first sight a reason why I transitioned over from Yu-Gi-Oh to Flesh and Blood, but for me, one of the core reasons, I think, why I took the leap and transitioned over to Flesh and Blood from Yu-Gi-Oh. Okay, I think that is all about it for today. We are, I see, at over 40 minutes. So I will do another video on this topic. I already have prepared it. Talking about like all these things in Yu-Gi-Oh! A little bit more in detail. And I also want to discuss and talk about this with you. And I think it's really important that we talk about this. I'm really happy that I actually did talk about this today. And I'm really, really thankful for all the experiences that no matter in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Flesh and Blood happened. So I hope you have a nice day now, and we see each other in the next video.